How you doing? Long time no see. I know I've been away for a while, but I'm making this video because I got a call from a former parent of mine. They're saying, "Hey, your selection process now, PEP. They need to get into high school. Uh, if you're unaware, I do have a little science behind how I tell my parents to select their schools so they get into the best possible schools based on their child's ability. Yes, it comes down to your child's scores, but for what parents don't know, there's a truth, a myth, and a lie behind how you fill out your selection form. You can fill out your form that you don't get any of the schools that you selected because you completely botched the order of it. And you can fill out the form that your child can hit the median to get into that school, and you actually get into there based on the competition. My assumption is there's about 30,000 kids doing the exam this year. It's always between 30,000 to 40,000 and change. So if that stays true, let's get into it. So I will break it down as best as possible and tell you the do's and don'ts. But before jumping into all that, complete disclaimer, I'll be using an old form from 2022. The concept is still the same. It's still a computer placing your children into schools. And I'll break down how the algorithm pretty much works, how the coding works, and what it does to kick out choices, put in choices, selections, all that blah, 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 blah stuff. Let's just get into it. All right. Old form. Like I said, I'm using an old form. This is from 2022, COVID time. The form might look the same. Um, so for this entire example, I'm going to be using Obiston Kinder Prep School as like I'm a parent at Obiston Kinder Prep School. That school is found off the Boulevard in Kingston. All right, keep that in mind. Address is very important for whatever school you're at. So regardless of whichever school you're at, keep that in mind. So if you're at a St. Andrew Prep, if you're at a St. Hugh's Prep, if you're at Woolmer's Prep, if you're at Dunrobin Primary, George Headley Primary, whichever school you're at, keep in mind your school's location because that is very important because the computer looks at that. The second thing, after saying that, the form highlights what I just said, all right? That your cluster schools must be in proximity of the school that the candidate now attends. This is a truth, a myth, and a lie all at the same time. Why? So let's assume that I'm filling out this form and I live in Corville, all right? Corville is in proximity of Boulevard and I attend Obiston. That statement would be very true in that case, because my home address and my school address are in proximity of each other. So my cluster schools, the only thing that the computer will see here is Edith Dalton James, Calabar High School, Pembroke Hall High School, anything in that little stretch from Mandela going up to, you might get as far as Mannings Hill Road. So Tarrant might even fall into this cluster school. Now, let's say I still attend Obiston, but I live in Portmore, okay? Nowhere near each other. The school and home are nowhere near each other. This statement now becomes a lie for the computer. This is not going to trigger in the computer if I live in Portmore and I attend Obiston. So based on where you live and where your school is, keep that in mind. So now if I live in Portmore, regardless of what I put here as cluster school as my sixth and seventh choice, the computer is only looking at schools in Portmore for my cluster school. All right. And now what ends up happening, it becomes an order of seating, meaning based on the scores of all the kids, that's where number 6 and number 7 gets filled in. So if you have 80 kids that hit 75% and they get clustered to a school near their home address, they might get to, what's that school again? The A name. Yeah, oh my God, Aston. And then you have You have Cedar Grove, but Cedar Grove is only if you live close to Cedar Grove, you'll get clustered there. And it's also a choice school. So based on it, I don't know why my brain just keep while I go on all the Portmore schools. I can hear the phone and the text is coming in already from the principals. Oh gosh, I just set up myself, don't it? So keep that in mind. You'll probably get clustered to Cedar Grove, Bridgeport High, Ascot. I know you may call me, Ascot. You're going to get clustered to those schools just because you live in Portmore. All right. I hope that makes sense. All right. The second part now that I'm going to break down is boys versus girls. The computer treats boys and girls differently. All right. I'm going to bring up the same form with some numbers and some schools on there. I'm going to tell you from now. The first one I'm going to bring up is what you're not supposed to do. And I'm going to explain why. All right. I'm going to bring up the boys one first, and then I'm going to bring up the girls one. In terms of boys and girls, boys have more schools, I should say more desired schools to select from because they're way more in demand all boys schools versus, I shouldn't say in demand all girls schools, they're just more all boys schools than all girls schools in general. And I'm thinking about Kingston in doing this. So if you're in rural Jamaica, same concept applies, but again, the based on the choice of schools. So my presentation is predominantly based on Kingston. But if you're thinking about a Monroe and a Glenmuir, like those are choice schools that you have to pick to get into. But there are other schools around, but people would prefer to go to Monroe and Glenmuir versus the other schools. Like they'll put those as their first and second choice. And again, comes down to your address. All right. So now I'm going to bring up the form and I'm going to bash on the fathers first. All right. Bringing up the form, I'm bashing on the fathers first. Let me just pause right there so and say, Miss Wilson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Myrie, all the principals, this is for educational purposes only. Okay? I'm not looking to offend anybody or offend the school. Educational purposes only. If you want to call me and nail me up, sure. But not call me and chastise me. All right, cool. So, educational purposes only. And again, this is from 2022, little bit for the tail end of COVID. And these were, the computer was looking at these scores to place kids. So let me break down these scores over here for you a little bit. All right, so in 2022, the computer was pretty much saying if the child scored 75 to 81 and they chose Calabar as their first choice, they could get in. Once they chose Calabar, they could get in. Not that they will get in, they could get in. KC was 80 to 85. JC was 78 to 83. Meadowbrook was 78 to 90, a wide range. And I'm going to explain why that range is so wide. And George's was at 80 to 91. Why is that range so wide for Meadowbrook? Where Meadowbrook is located, Meadowbrook is a choice school as well as a cluster school. All right. So that means you have people selecting to go to Meadowbrook based on the programs that they offer, as well as the government has them as a cluster school. And I can tell you this right now, every year I get a bag of call if I can make a call to Mr. Facey to help get the child into Meadowbrook, and I already know the answer. Because Meadowbrook is a choice school and a cluster school, Mr. Facey don't have the space to take no transfer. He doesn't. Okay? So unless Mr. Facey put up a brand new building or something, or a bunch of kids decide to migrate and space open up, it's the only way you're going to get into Meadowbrook if you haven't passed for Meadowbrook, either by selection or by cluster. I eat that. Eat that. All right, Mr. Facey? I try to explain it. All right. So now, go back to this form. I break down that. The cluster school right here, this parent had selected Arden. This is actually a form. Just know that this is actually a form of a parent. They put Arden High and then Woolmer's Boys. And again, based on this form, because it was a die-hard Calabar father, this child is only getting into Calabar. Only getting into Calabar. The The only way they would not get into Calabar is if their percentile falls below 75%. Percentile and percent are two different things. Two different things. Remember, we're talking about a computer program. Why, what that mean, how that makes sense, it's just computer coding. So why I say that now? This child goes to Obiston. They selected Calabar, KC, JC, Meadowbrook, Georges, Arden, Woolmers. Everything here is to get kicked out just on the way that they selected their schools. Why is that? If you look at the percentage requirements to get into KC, the percentage requirement to get into KC is higher than the percentage requirement to get into Calabar. All right? So if these were flipped around, it would make sense. He has a better chance of getting into KC than Calabar if these were flipped around. Then you're also looking at St. George's College. So the child would only get into Calabar. And let's break down all of these choices now. If you look on the requirements on the right-hand side, the highest scores to get in are Woolmers and Arden. They're identical. But what makes them different? Arden and Woolmers are located in two different areas. They're both a choice school and a cluster school. All right, they're in demand, they're choice, they're cluster. But what makes them different though is Arden is trying to get girls into their school, whereas Woolmers is just straight boys. All right, so remember I tell you the requirement for boys and girls are different. What this means is as a boy, you'd have to be on the higher scale to get into Arden. So Woolmers Arden would have to be a first, second choice based on the requirements to get in. The third choice, according to these numbers, automatically would fall to Georges because Georges was at 80 to 91. All right. So Arden, Woolmers would have to be first. So if you want a child to go to a co-ed school or all boys school, and then Georges would be third. Fourth choice would then have to be KC. All right. And then you can fill out whichever one, Calabar or JC to be your fifth choice. Hope that makes sense. Hope that makes sense. So let's jump over now to if your child is a high performing student. If your child is a high performing student, they're hitting straight A's and occasional B, things like that. You have to fill out your form in a specific order or your child is not going to get into the school you want. Hands down, the computer is not going to select them for the school you want. Right off the bat, if Arden, whether you're a boy or a girl, Campion, whether you're a boy or a girl, if Campion is not your first choice school, you're not going there. You're not going there. So I've had a father, well, not just a father, I've had fathers who are from KC, JC, Woolmers, Calabar, all of the schools, proud fathers, proud of the school that they went to, part of Old Boy Association, but they had a son that was brilliant. But of course they said, no man, my school have to go on there first. They put Campion second. Results come around. They get into the school, obviously. They get into the KC, the Woolmers, the Calabar, because that was their first choice, and they had Campion second. But what the reality hit now is the scores of the boys who actually got into Campion, these fathers, their sons scored higher than those boys. But because Campion was second choice on their form, they did not get into Campion. All right. And then they're looking for a transfer and they try to use links and things like that. If you want your child to go to Campion, if your child has the ability to get into Campion, Campion has to be your first choice. If it's not your first choice, they're not going. All right. And a little thing that occurred was it the last or the one before? Campion was trying to get more boys into their school because their female population was so high. They actually lowered the threshold for the boys a little bit. So a lot more boys actually passed to get into Campion. So more boys were getting in on the 91 to 93 percentile versus trying to hit the 95 and above. So all those boys that had Campion as their first choice as boy, I know I can make it in, but we'll see. And then they put their other choices as second, third, fourth. They actually got into Campion on their first choice because Campion is looking for more boys. Is that the case now? Don't know because I don't know how many boys they've gotten into the school over the last 2 years. Again, I'm not in Jamaica. I'm not in Jamaica. I'm telling you how the computer program works. All right. If you look at the flow of my diagram, you see how the percentage flow. So Campion was number one with a 91 to 95 percentile. It has Arden, Woolmer's, or George's with an 85 to 95 percentile, followed by Woolmer's, George's, KC, or JC ranging from 78 to 85 percentile. All right. I know you're saying, but that number they did different from the last sheet. Yeah. Remember I said the last time Woolmer's was 85 to 91 right here. I said it was 85 to 91, but now it actually dropped to 78 to 85 because I have Woolmer's as my third choice instead of trying to get into Woolmer's as a cluster school. So trying to get into Woolmer's as a cluster school, it boosts up as 85 to 95% versus me outright selecting Woolmer's to go there. I hope that makes sense. If that never makes sense, pull up the video and play it again. All right. It's the same thing with your Arden and your Georges. And you realize I have Arden and Georges here. I mean, Woolmer's and Georges here twice. So if I'm trying to get there as my second choice, yes, the 85 to 95 remains. If I'm trying to get there as my third choice, it becomes a battle of how many boys hit that 85%, because I hit 78%, and I'm trying to get in based on numbers and selection. But remember, Woolmer's is located at Hero Circle. That's a big cluster. It's a very big cluster. So a lot of those boys are getting into Woolmer's based on cluster on the 78 to 83 percentile, 78 to 85 percentile. All right, that's how the computer looks at it. That's how the computer looks at it. All right, cluster schools now. I know that was kind of headachy, but cluster schools now. Cluster schools, for the most part, is based on your address versus the actual school you attend. I said that earlier. All right. So again, still on the assumption that this is for Obiston. Still on the assumption that I live in Corville, do Corville, the Henny Park region. Automatically, Calabar, Meadowbrook, Licketeen bit becomes a cluster school. All right. But because I select it and I live in the region, I have a good chance of getting there. All right. So cluster schools, you have to treat it in that dynamic. But remember now, again, if I live in Portmore or Spanish Town, these cluster schools don't apply. Jago now becomes a cluster school. St. Catherine High becomes a cluster school because I live in Spain. Okay? That's how the computer looks at your thing. All right. Done with the boy them now. All right, so the girls are going to do the same thing, but the girls, their selection is a bit different because of where the girls' schools are located, and again, the selection process. All right. So this is an actual form again. This is an actual form from a parent back in the day. The mother was Queens right through. Queens right through. The child had the ability to get into St. Andrew and Immaculate. But the mother was like, boy, I mean, I know. She went to Queens and the auntie went to Holy Child. Because mommy went to Queens, mommy put Queens as the first choice school. Auntie went to Holy Childhood, so she put Holy Child as the second choice school. And then she put Andrews, Immaculate, and Campion. Yes, the child had the ability to get into Campion. And then, based on where they lived, they had Merle Grove as the cluster school. Remember, I'm assuming again that everything's obvious done. And then they had St. Hugh's. Now, St. Hugh's and Merle Grove are nowhere in proximity of each other. Nowhere. Okay? So this form, I remember I told you she had the ability to get into Campion. But there's no way she's getting into Campion because it's a fifth choice school. This child is definitely going to Queens because I know she has the ability, definitely going to Queens based on this form. The only way she would not get into Queens is if there are other girls like her that hit a high percentile, they filled out the slot for Queens, then she'd get pushed to Holy Child. All right, that's what this form is saying. but it wrong. It wrong up. Because the computer, looking at the logic of this, the computer would probably just kick this out and place you in a cluster school closest to your home address. All right? How the form should look, how that form should have looked. Again, if your child have the ability, champion have to be the first choice. Have to be the first choice. If your child has the ability to get into Campion, we're talking about girls, your child has the ability to get into Campion, and let's say the spaces fill out or they just didn't make the cut, Immaculate or St. Andrew is your second choice, depending on what's your preference. Immaculate and St. Andrew are always competing. And why I say that, you have, let's put St. Andrew, yeah, St. Andrew Prep and Immaculate Prep on the map, all right? Girls from Immaculate Prep, they selected Immaculate High School as their first choice. They didn't make this the cut because, again, Immaculate is a cluster school. A lot of people don't know that. Immaculate's a government school, so it is a cluster school and it is a choice school and it's an in-demand school. So once their brackets get filled out very quickly, so even girls from Immaculate Prep don't get into Immaculate High right off the bat. They get pushed into St. Andrew High, which is their second choice. On the flip side, though, Immaculate looks out for their own because the prep school is a small school. They're going to fit their girls into the high school. All right. So now those girls that actually pass for St. Andrew High, they're going to go to Immaculate High. They're going to go there. Those spaces that opened up for St. Andrew High are automatically filled out. Automatically. Because again, you have St. Andrew Prep students, the girls, are trying to get into the high school. St. Andrew High is a choice school. And again, it is a cluster school. The thing about St. Andrew High is it's such an in-demand school with such a strong heritage and everything. You have the Old Girl Association. You have the charters and the chapters from all over the place. They are putting their families in the school. The thing is, when you try to look for a transfer, even though all those immaculate girls pass for St. Andrew and they're not going there, those spaces are already gone. Like that's just the short version of it. Those spaces are already gone. And unless you're coming to help to build a new tennis court or a new auditorium or something, you're not getting in there. You're not getting in there as a transfer without some serious links. That's just the short version. All right. So that's just a short version. There's no other way to say it. So as a girl, if you're capable, it's Campion, Immaculate, or St. Andrew. You'd put Immaculate first if you're not from Immaculate. Um, then my recommendation would be Arden High, Wilmot's Girls. All right. Why? Arden is a great school, they have great program. They've always had a great science program. So once you're into the sciences or anything like that, Arden is where you want to go. Wilmot's Girls also has a great program. They have a great athletic program. So you want to get into one of those. So as a girl, if you live in Kingston and you have the ability, Campion, Immaculate, Andrews, Arden, Wilmot's Girls. Immaculate and St. Andrew can interchange based on what's your preference. Some people prefer St. Andrew, some people prefer Immaculate. All right. And then you can fill out um, Holy Child with Queens, St. Hugh's, Mona, Excelsior. Again, based on the order that you want, based on the program that you're trying to get into. Excelsior has a great football program for girls. It's phenomenal. There's also a great theater program that it just depends on what you're looking for. All right. And then again, based on where you live, if you look at this, Meadowbrook and Merle Grove are in proximity of each other and in proximity of the home address. So your cluster schools include means if you don't get into any of the top, you get into your cluster schools. So this form, if it goes in this order, this form is actually perfect. All right. So let's say you're just wishing your child does well to get into Campion. This will work. If you're wishing that they can get into Immaculate, it will work. And then it flows. So let's say they're not the caliber of a Campion, Immaculate, St. Andrew High, Arden. The Woolmore's Girl, Holy Child with Queens will fill out. All right. And then between the Mona and St. Hugh's will pretty much depend on your home address, and then you would get into the Excelsior if this is your selection choice. The computer would favor you this way, or it will jump straight to your cluster school and you're going to Meadowbrook or Merle Grove. Sound insane, no? All right. All right. So I know that was a bit confusing, but play back the video, look at the form. In a nutshell, what I'm saying is if you're a die-hard parent for a specific school and your child is capable of getting into a higher caliber school, if you put your school that you went as a parent and you know that's the love, even if your child gets the score to get into Campion, Immaculate, whichever school Arden, but you wanted to go to your traditional school. If that's your first choice, that's the school your child is going to, based on how the computer does the algorithm. So your first to fifth has to be in order of the requirements to get into the school, not in order of how you like to get into the school. All right. Your cluster school will only make sense if you live close to the school that you presently attend. Yes, your cluster school will fall into your school address. If you live far from the school that you attend to, your cluster school is really on your home address. You can look back at the history of from GSAT, PEP, common entrance. That is how the computer selects it. That's why I tell you it's a truth, a myth, and a lie. All right? Because based on where you live, where you go to school, that's what the computer looks at. No one is going to sit down and manually place 40,000 kids every single year. It's not gonna work. The computer does that for you, and the human beings will pick out if there's an error, the humans fix that error. All right? So I hope this confusing video makes sense. I got a random call from a parent, and I said, let me just do a little video to try and explain it. It's a bit confusing, but if you follow the logic of flowing in order of, I don't want to say prestige of the school, but the demand of the school. All right, so the demand of the school, put it in order of the demand, regardless of where you live in Jamaica. So whether in rural Jamaica, if you're in the city, the demand of the school that is in proximity of you that you're trying to get into, that's how you fill out the form from 1 to 5th. And your cluster school, if you do not live near the school that you attend, your cluster school is automatically near your address. It sounds repetitive now, so that means it's time to finish the video. All the best, guys. I hope this made sense. All the best to all the kids that will be doing PEP in a couple months. I wish you the best of luck. And parents, remember, it is your child's selection. It is your child's life. It is for them future. Stop trying to live through you pick them. Yes, you want to be proud of them and everything, but like I said, I'm going to bash the fathers. The fathers ruin it every year for them son, unless their sons really, 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 really want to go to the school that their fathers went to. That's just a short and sweet version of it. All right. All right. Thank you for watching. If you want more sober logic, tune into another video. All right. Peace.